He sees me. The silence in my sister's apartment was the worst part. It was a weighted, heavy thing, pressing down from the ceiling and rising up from the floorboards. It was the kind of quiet that follows a scream you never heard. Maya had been gone for 3 days. The police called it a walk away. A young woman, stressed from her job, just needing to clear her head. I knew better. Maya didn't walk away from things. She ran straight at them. I stood in the middle of her living room, the scent of lavender and old books filling my nose. It smelled like her. On the coffee table, a mug of tea had grown a pale green film. Her keys were in the ceramic bowl by the door. Her wallet, with cash and cards, was on the kitchen counter. People who walk away tend to take those things with them. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with exhaustion, had just shrugged. Sometimes they don't, Elias. Sometimes they just go. I wasn't looking for clues, not really. I was just trying to feel her presence one last time before the silence swallowed it whole. I ran my hand along the spines of her books, a chaotic mix of poetry and dense historical texts. She was a contradiction, my sister. A dreamer with a pragmatist's heart. My gaze fell upon her sketchbook, left open on the small wooden desk by the window. Maya was always drawing. It was her way of thinking, of processing the world. The pages were filled with sketches of people on the bus, architectural details of our small town of Havenwood, the way light fell through the leaves of the oak tree outside. But the last page was different. It was a single figure, drawn in the center of the crisp white paper. It was rendered with a frantic, aggressive energy I had never seen in her work. The lines were thick, pressed hard into the page with a black crayon. It was humanoid, but only just. Its limbs were too long, jointed at odd, unsettling angles. It had no face, just a smooth, ovalless space where features should have been. But the truly disturbing part was its outline. It wasn't a solid, continuous line. It was jagged, broken, and chaotic, as if the hand that drew it was trembling violently. It looked less like a finished drawing and more like a furious scribble trying to contain something. A ragged outline of a man. Below it, in Maya's usually neat script, were 2 words. He sees me. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. I tore the page from the sketchbook, folded it carefully, and put it in my jacket pocket. It felt strangely heavy, like a stone. The next day, driven by a gnawing dread, I started my own investigation. I was the town librarian, which gave me a certain access, a certain trust. I started with the other disappearances. There had been 4 in the last year. Old Mr. Abernathy, the retired mailman. A teenage boy named Sam. A young mother, Sarah, who vanished from her own backyard. The police had no leads, no connections. They were just isolated tragedies in a town that wasn't used to them. I went to the Abernathy house first. His daughter was there, packing his life into cardboard boxes. I told her I was from the town historical society, preserving memories. A gentle lie. She was grateful for the distraction. We talked about her father, his routines, his love for gardening. As I was about to leave, I asked a strange question. Was your father artistic at all? Did he draw? She gave me a curious look. Not really. But it's funny you ask. The week before he went missing, he was doodling. Obsessively. On napkins, on the back of envelopes. Just the same weird thing, over and over. She paused, her brow furrowed in thought. She rummaged through a box labeled desk and pulled out a stack of envelopes. On the back of one, scrawled in blue ballpoint pen, was a figure. My blood ran cold. It was the same one. The same impossibly long limbs, the same featureless face. The same chaotic, ragged outline. It was less detailed than Maya's, a quicker sketch, but it was undeniably the same entity. I made my excuses and left, my heart hammering against my ribs. I visited the families of the other two victims. Sam's mother, through her tears, showed me a drawing she found in his math textbook. Sarah's husband showed me a charcoal sketch she had done on an easel in their sunroom, a piece she had become fixated on before she vanished. They were all the same. Every single person who had disappeared from Havenwood had first drawn the ragged outline. The thing in my pocket no longer felt like a stone. It felt like a seed. A terrible, patient seed. My library became my sanctuary and my laboratory. The public section, with its cheerful lighting and whispered conversations, felt like a world away. I retreated to the archives in the basement, a place few people ever saw. The air down there was cool and dry, thick with the scent of aging paper and binder's glue. It was a tomb of memories, of forgotten histories, and I was its keeper. Now, I was its interrogator. I pushed aside my usual work of digitizing old photographs and cataloging donated journals. My mission was singular. I needed to know if this had happened before. This feeling, this chilling pattern, felt older than the past year. It felt ancient. My search began with the town's law enforcement records, going back a century. I pulled out heavy, dust-covered ledgers. The disappearances were all there, recorded in elegant, looping cursive or the stark, mechanical type of later years. Missing persons. Runaways. Unsolved cases. They were peppered throughout Havenwood's history, little blips of tragedy that were noted and, eventually, forgotten by the wider community. But I wasn't looking at the community. I was looking for the individual threads. I cross-referenced the names from the police logs with the library's own archives, family histories, local newspaper articles on microfilm, school yearbooks. It was slow, painstaking work. Days bled into nights. I survived on stale coffee and the frantic energy of fear. I felt like an archaeologist carefully brushing dirt from a bone, terrified of what the full skeleton might look like. After a week of relentless digging, I found him. A man named Thomas Adler. He disappeared in 1958. The official report was brief. He was a 45-year-old widower, a watchmaker, who lived alone. One day, he simply wasn't there anymore. His shop was locked, his house was neat, nothing was missing. He had just evaporated. The case went cold within months. But in a box of unsorted donations from the Adler estate, given to the library decades ago, I found a small, leather-bound journal. His journal. Most of it was mundane, notes on watch repairs, observations about the weather, thoughts on his late wife. But the last dozen pages were a descent. His neat handwriting grew spidery, agitated. He wrote about a dream. A dream of a tall, thin man standing at the edge of his vision, a man made of static and broken lines. He wrote that he couldn't get the image out of his head. He felt a profound, inexplicable need to give it form. And then I saw it. Tucked between the last two pages of the journal was a small, brittle piece of paper. On it, drawn in faded graphite, was the figure. The ragged outline. It was the same creature from Maya's sketchbook, from Mr. Abernathy's envelope. The same impossible anatomy, the same haunting emptiness. My hands trembled as I held it. This was proof. This was a cycle. I kept digging, fueled by a new, horrifying certainty. I found another case from 1923. A young woman, a poet, who had filled the margins of her notebooks with frantic sketches of the hollow man, as she called it, before she vanished while walking home. I found a reference in a letter from 1887, where a farmer writes to his brother in another state about their cousin, who had become obsessed with carving a splintered figure. into pieces of wood before he walked into the forest and was never seen again. It was always the same. A period of artistic fixation, a sudden and total disappearance. The entity had been feeding on my town for generations. A new kind of fear began to take root in my mind, something colder and more personal than grief. I started feeling watched, even in the deep, silent solitude of the archives. The long, unlit corridors between the towering shelves seemed to stretch into infinity. I would catch a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision, a distortion in the air, a smudge of shadow where no shadow should be. When I would whip my head around, there was nothing there. Just shelves and books and silence. One evening, as I was examining the 1958 drawing under a magnifying lamp, I saw something that made me drop the delicate paper. In the empty space where the face should be, for a fraction of a second, I thought I saw a pattern. 2 dark spots, like hollow eyes, staring back at me. I blinked, and it was gone. It was just blank paper again. Was I just exhausted? Was my mind, saturated with grief and fear, starting to play tricks on me? Or was the act of looking, of giving this thing my undivided attention, somehow inviting it in? I carefully placed the drawing back in its archival sleeve. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The ragged outline was no longer just a drawing. It was an awareness. And I had its full attention. The paranoia was a constant companion now, a low hum beneath the surface of my thoughts. The world outside the library archives had begun to feel thin, like a stage set. The real world was here, in the dust and the silence, with the whispers of the lost. I stopped going home, sleeping on a cot I set up between shelves of Civil War histories. I told Sheriff Brody I was working on a big historical project for the town's anniversary. It was a flimsy excuse, but he was too overworked to question it. He just looked at me with pity in his tired eyes. The change began subtly. It wasn't a voice in my head. It was an impulse, a physical urge that started in my fingertips. Whenever I picked up a pen to make a note, my hand would pause. I would feel a strange, alien desire to let the pen move on its own, to sketch a long, unnaturally bent limb, to draw a jagged, broken line. At first, it was easy to fight. I would clench my fist, put the pen down, and take a deep breath. I would focus on my research, on the facts, on the names and dates. But the impulse grew stronger each day, more insistent. It was like an itch on the inside of my brain. I started avoiding pens and pencils altogether, doing all my work on the computer. But then I would see the figure in the cursor's steady blink. A straight, solid line. A line that wanted to be broken. I found myself tracing the shape on dusty surfaces with my finger, only to recoil in horror at what I was doing. I saw it everywhere. In the tangled branches of the trees outside the basement window. In the cracks of the concrete floor. In the way a coat was draped over a chair. The world was resolving itself into the shape of the monster. My focus shifted from the victims to the entity itself. Thomas Adler's journal was my Rosetta Stone. He wrote, in his last lucid entry, "It is not a thing to be seen. It is a thing to be known. And once known, it must be drawn. It is an empty space that demands to be outlined." An empty space. The words echoed in my mind. The ragged outline wasn't a creature that existed independently. It was a concept, a void. A psychological parasite. It didn't hunt its victims, it infected them. The drawing wasn't a portrait of something the victims saw. It was a symptom of the infection. The final, desperate act of a mind trying to externalize the horror that was consuming it from within. And by externalizing it, they set the trap for the next person who looked too closely. Like me. I realized with a jolt of pure terror that Maya, Mr. Abernathy, and all the others weren't taken. They were integrated. The entity was an outline, and it used the life force, the very essence of its victims, to fill itself in. They weren't dead. They were the color and texture and substance within the lines. They were the thing itself. And they had disappeared from the world because they had been entirely poured into that other, drawn reality. The compulsion became a physical torment. My hands would ache. My right hand, the one I wrote with, would sometimes tremble uncontrollably. I took to sitting on it, trapping it beneath my leg as I read. I was terrified of my own body, of what it might do without my permission. One night, the hum of the archive's ancient ventilation system seemed to fade away. The silence that replaced it was absolute, profound. I looked up from a brittle newspaper clipping and saw it. It wasn't in the corner of my eye. It was standing at the far end of the corridor of shelves, a place where the light from my lamp didn't quite reach. It was a column of deeper darkness, a tear in the visual fabric of the room. It had the familiar shape, the tall, thin frame, the impossibly jointed limbs. It wasn't solid. It was like heat haze, a shimmering distortion of the space it occupied. There was no face, but I felt its gaze on me, a pressure inside my skull. It wasn't threatening. It was just waiting. Patiently. My heart seized in my chest. I couldn't breathe. My hand, the one I had been sitting on, shot out and grabbed a thick marker from a cup on my desk. The desire was no longer an itch. It was a roaring fire. I needed to draw it. I needed to capture it, to pin it to the page, to understand it. It was the only thing that made sense. I uncapped the marker. The sharp, chemical smell filled the air. I held the tip just above a blank sheet of paper. My hand was shaking, but not from fear anymore. It was from anticipation. Relief. Just one line. That's all it would take. With a strangled cry, I threw the marker across the room. It clattered against a metal shelf and fell to the floor. The figure in the darkness was gone. I was alone again, panting in the silence, my hand throbbing with a phantom ache. I had won the battle, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my very soul, that I was losing the war. The incident with the marker was a turning point. Hiding was no longer an option. Fighting the compulsion was a losing battle. It was like trying to hold back the tide with my bare hands. Every time I resisted, the pressure built, and the entity's presence in my waking world grew stronger. I knew the next time the urge came, I wouldn't be able to stop myself. I would draw the figure, and I would be lost, just like Maya. Just like all the others. My only hope was to change the rules of the game. If I couldn't fight the parasite in my own mind, maybe I could attack its source in the physical world. I went back to the oldest records, the ones from the town's founding in the late 1700s. Havenwood was established by a splinter group of a severe, ascetic religious sect. They were extremists who believed art and all forms of effigy were vanity, a doorway for demons. Their leader was a man named Jedediah Blackwood, a charismatic and reportedly terrifying preacher. I found his name in the oldest town ledger, and beside it, a note, lost to his own sermon, 1798. My blood turned to ice. Lost to his own sermon. What a strange, poetic way to record a disappearance. I found a map of the original settlement. Most of the buildings were long gone, reclaimed by time and progress. But one structure was marked on the edge of the old town grounds, deep in what was now the thickest part of the woods, the Blackwood Chapel. The map had a small annotation next to it, forsaken. It was never torn down. It was simply abandoned, left for the forest to swallow. I knew, with an instinct that transcended logic, that this was the place. This was the nest. The entity was born here, in a place built on the fear of images, a fear so profound that it manifested the very thing it sought to forbid. I gathered a small bag, a powerful flashlight, a crowbar, and a bottle of water. I left the archives, stepping out into a gray, drizzling afternoon. The sky wept over Havenwood, as it always seemed to do. The path to the chapel wasn't on any modern map. I had to use the old one, navigating by the shape of hills and the curve of a creek bed. The woods grew thick and tangled, the light fading under the dense canopy of leaves. After 2 hours of pushing through wet branches and thorns, I saw it. It was a skeletal structure, barely standing. The roof had mostly caved in, but the stone walls, covered in a thick blanket of ivy, were still intact. The wooden door had long since rotted away, leaving a dark, gaping maw. The air grew cold as I approached, the drizzle turning into a steady, chilling rain. Stepping inside was like entering another time. The smell was of damp earth, rotting wood, and something else. Something metallic and faintly electric, like the air after a lightning strike. The flashlight beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, illuminating rows of broken pews, all facing a simple stone altar at the far end. The silence in here was different from the library. It was a listening silence. An ancient silence. I felt it before I saw it. The pressure in my head returned, stronger than ever. The air in the center of the chapel began to shimmer, to warp. The ragged outline coalesced from the shadows. It was clearer now, more defined, as if it were drawing strength from this place. It stood before the altar, its long, broken limbs perfectly still. It was just watching me, waiting for the inevitable. My flashlight beam moved past it, to the stone wall behind the altar. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a blank wall. The entire surface was a tapestry of scratches. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them, layered over one another for more than 2 centuries. All depicting the same figure. Some were crude, gouged with desperation. Others were fine, almost elegant. All were the ragged outline. Generations of victims had been drawn here, to this place, to leave their mark before they were taken. And in the very center, carved deep into the stone of the altar itself, was the first one. It was larger, more primal. The lines were jagged and full of a furious, terrifying energy. This was Jedediah Blackwood's. This was the original sin. The first drawing that had given the formless horror a name and a shape. I raised the crowbar. The air crackled. The figure didn't move, but I felt a wave of pure, undiluted despair wash over me. A silent command to stop. But there was something else mixed in with my fear now. A flicker of hope. If I could destroy this altar, if I could shatter this original carving, maybe I could break the cycle. Maybe I could starve the entity. I took a step forward, the crowbar heavy in my hands. The ragged outline just watched. And waited. I swung the crowbar. The clang of steel against ancient stone echoed like a gunshot in the dead chapel. A chip of rock flew from the edge of the altar. The shimmering figure of the ragged outline seemed to flinch, its form wavering like a disturbed reflection in water. A surge of adrenaline, of triumph, shot through me. It was working. I swung again, and again, my movements becoming frantic, desperate. I was no longer just a librarian, a grieving brother. I was a warrior fighting a ghost with a piece of steel. Chips of stone flew. Dust filled the damp air. I poured all my grief for Maya, my fear, my rage into every strike. I was breaking the anchor. I was erasing the source. But then, something strange happened. With every piece of the altar I broke away, the pressure in my head did not lessen. It intensified. The air grew thick, heavy, humming with a power that made my teeth ache. The shimmering outline of the creature before me did not fade or weaken. It began to solidify. The hazy, indistinct lines of its form grew sharp, defined. the transparent limbs filled with a darkness that seemed to drink the light from my flashlight. It was no longer a ghost made of shadow and distortion. It was becoming real. I stopped, my arms trembling from exertion, the crowbar feeling slick in my grip. I stared at the creature as a horrifying understanding dawned, a truth so simple and so absolute it felt like a physical blow. I had it all wrong. The entity didn't feed on the drawings. The drawings were just the invitations, the doorways. It fed on attention, on obsession, on emotion. The victims who came here and carved their desperate copies were giving it sustenance. Thomas Adler in his loneliness, the young poet in her melancholy, Maya in her stress. They had all fed it. But I had done something no one else ever had. I had discovered the pattern. I had unearthed its history. I had given it more focused, intense, and terrified attention than anyone in 200 years. And now, here, at its nexus, I was trying to destroy its heart. This act of destruction was the ultimate act of attention. I wasn't starving it. I was giving it a feast. I was completing it. The ragged outline was no longer ragged. It stood before me, a perfect silhouette of a man, carved from a darkness so profound it seemed to have its own gravity. The space where its face should be was still blank, a smooth void. It took a step toward me. It made no sound, but I heard it in my mind, a feeling of arrival, of gratitude. All the fight drained out of me. The crowbar fell from my numb fingers and clattered onto the stone floor. The fear was gone. The grief was gone. The desperate need to find my sister was gone. All of it was replaced by a vast, calm emptiness. A sense of peace. I finally understood. I understood what Maya must have felt in her final moments. This wasn't a monster to be fought. It was a solution. An escape from the pain and the noise of the world. The disappearance wasn't an abduction. It was a release. It was the peace of becoming part of something whole, of filling in a beautiful, empty space. The compulsion was back, but it was no longer a struggle. It was a gentle, loving invitation. My purpose was clear. I looked around the floor of the ruined chapel. My eyes fell on a piece of charcoal, likely from a timber that had fallen from the ceiling long ago. I walked over and picked it up. It felt cool and right in my hand. I walked to a clear, smooth patch of the stone floor, away from the dust and debris of my failed effort. I knelt down. The dark figure stood over me, watching, waiting. Its presence was no longer terrifying. It was comforting. A promise. My hand was perfectly steady as I touched the charcoal to the stone. I began to draw. A long, elegant limb. A slender torso. The familiar, impossible angles came not from memory, but from instinct. I wasn't copying the thing before me. I was drawing myself. My own outline. As I drew the final, clean line of the head, a sense of profound relief washed over me. I felt light. I looked down at my hand, the one holding the charcoal. It was growing faint, translucent, the solid flesh and bone resolving into little more than a sketch. The world around me, the damp chapel, the gray light, the sound of the rain, all of it began to fade into a distant hum. I was being unwritten. My own ragged outline was finally being filled in. And as the last mote of my physical being dissolved into the drawing on the floor, I felt a flicker of someone else's presence joining mine within the whole. Maya? There was no answer. Only a perfect, silent, and eternal darkness. And on the floor of the abandoned chapel, a new drawing lay among the rubble, waiting for the next curious soul to find it. Don't fall asleep. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It was a deep, invasive cold that had settled into the bones of the house, a damp chill that the humming furnace could not seem to touch. I burrowed deeper under the covers, pulling the duvet up to my nose. My breath plumed in the air, a small, fleeting cloud in the dim pre-dawn light. It was strange. The thermostat was new, one of those smart devices I could control from my phone, and I had set it to a steady 68 degrees. There was no reason for the house to feel like a walk-in freezer. I tossed and turned for a few more minutes, but sleep was a distant shore I could no longer reach. The cold was a physical presence, a weight on my chest. With a groan, I threw the covers off and swung my legs out of bed. The floorboards were like sheets of ice against the soles of my feet. I shivered, a violent, full-body tremor, and stood up. The house was silent, save for the low thrum of the refrigerator downstairs and the gentle tick of a wall clock. I pulled on a thick sweatshirt I had left draped over a chair and made my way out of the bedroom. The hallway was even colder. A persistent draft snaked its way along the floor, caressing my ankles. I frowned, running a hand through my sleep-tangled hair. Maybe I had left a window open. I had only been in this house for 2 weeks, and I was still learning its quirks, the way the wind whistled through a specific window frame, or how a certain floorboard always creaked. This was my fresh start. New town, new job, a quiet little house on the edge of a wooded cul-de-sac. It was supposed to be peaceful. As I descended the stairs, the source of the draft became obvious. It was flowing up from the first floor, a steady, frigid river of air. My confusion slowly began to curdle into a tight knot of unease in my stomach. I reached the bottom of the staircase and looked toward the entryway. My front door was wide open. It was not just unlocked or ajar. It was fully, completely open, gaping into the blue-black darkness of the early morning. The small welcome mat was askew, and a few dead leaves had skittered into the foyer, pushed by a breeze I could not feel from where I stood. I just stared. For a long moment, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. I lived alone. I was meticulous about locking my doors. It was a ritual born from years of apartment living in the city. I would lock the deadbolt, then the handle, and give the door a firm push to make sure it was secure. I had done it last night. I remembered the satisfying click of the tumblers falling into place. My first thought was that I had been robbed. Heart hammering against my ribs, I flicked on the light switch. The living room flooded with a warm, yellow glow, revealing everything to be exactly as I had left it. The television was still on its stand. My laptop was on the coffee table. My wallet was on the kitchen counter where I had dropped it. Nothing was missing, nothing was out of place, except for the massive, gaping hole in the security of my home. I walked cautiously to the doorway and peered out into the street. It was empty. The world was still and quiet. A single street lamp cast long, skeletal shadows from the trees across my lawn. I shut the door, my hand trembling slightly as I twisted the deadbolt home. The sound was loud in the silence. The cold draft was cut off instantly. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood of the door, taking deep breaths. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I had been so tired from unpacking that I had only thought I locked it. Maybe a strong gust of wind had somehow blown it open, even with the latch. These explanations felt flimsy, like thin paper trying to cover a chasm. Then I remembered the camera. As part of my home's security obsession, I had installed a small surveillance camera aimed at my front porch. It was mostly for package deliveries, but it recorded any motion day or night. With a new sense of purpose, I went to the kitchen, grabbed my phone from the counter, and opened the security app. My fingers felt clumsy and slow. I navigated to the timeline for last night, my thumb scrolling back through the hours of stillness. There. At 2:17 a.m., a motion alert. The thumbnail showed the door opening. I tapped on it, and the video began to play. The footage was grainy, rendered in the eerie monochrome of night vision. But it was undeniably clear. The videos showed me. I watched myself walk into the frame from the side, as if coming from the living room. My movements were slow, almost placid. I was wearing the same pajamas I had woken up in. My eyes were open, but they had a glassy, unfocused look to them. I watched as my own hands, moving with a calm deliberation that felt utterly alien, reached for the locks. I saw my fingers turn the deadbolt with practiced ease. I saw myself twist the knob on the handle. There was no hesitation. There was no fumbling. I simply unlocked the door, pulled it open, and then stood there for a full minute, staring out into the darkness. Then, just as calmly, I turned and walked back out of the frame, leaving the door to swing silently open to the night. I had unlocked it in my sleep. The following day was a haze of caffeine and creeping anxiety. I rewatched the video at least 20 times, each viewing making me feel colder than the last. It was the look on my face that disturbed me the most. It was not the slack-jawed, vacant expression of a typical sleepwalker. It was serene. My features were composed, my posture straight. I looked like I was welcoming an expected guest, someone I was pleased to see. The idea was so unsettling that I felt a wave of nausea. I tried to dismiss it as a fluke, a one-time event brought on by the stress of the move, by sleeping in a new and unfamiliar environment. Our minds do strange things under pressure. That evening I took precautions. I was determined not to let it happen again. It was not enough to just lock the door. I engaged the deadbolt and the handle lock as usual. Then I slid the heavy-duty chain lock into its groove. For good measure, I wedged the back of a solid oak dining chair up under the doorknob, angling it so that any pressure from the outside would only jam it more firmly in place. Standing back, I surveyed my handiwork. It looked ridiculous, like the paranoid setup of a character in a spy movie. But it made me feel marginally safer. No amount of placid sleepwalking was going to get through that. I went to bed feeling tense, my ears straining against the quiet of the house. Every creak of the floorboards settling, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sent a jolt through my nervous system. It took hours, but eventually, exhaustion won the battle against my fear, and I fell into a deep, troubled sleep, punctuated by dreams I could not remember upon waking. The cold was what woke me again. It was the same bone-deep chill from the night before, a silent announcement that something was wrong. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart instantly pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I did not even need to get up. I knew. I could feel the draft, a cold tongue licking at the air from the bottom of my bedroom door. I threw the covers off, my bare feet hitting the frigid floorboards, and ran. I did not bother with the lights. I stormed down the stairs, my mind a whirlwind of denial and dread. Please, I thought, let it be a window this time. Let me have forgotten something. But I knew I had not. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped, my breath catching in my throat. The front door was wide open again, a perfect rectangle of pale, gray dawn. The chain lock dangled uselessly from its track, hanging limp and defeated. And the oak chair, my final bastion of security, had been carefully, almost politely, moved aside. It was not knocked over or shoved away. It was placed neatly against the wall a few feet away, as if someone had taken the time to set it out of the way before proceeding. My blood ran cold. This was not possible. A sleepwalker could not perform such a sequence of complex, delicate tasks. Unlatching a chain requires a specific sliding motion. Moving a heavy chair without making a sound requires conscious effort. My rational, logical mind was screaming, but there was no explanation that fit. Then I saw it. On the pristine surface of my light-colored welcome mat, just inside the threshold, was something that had not been there before. It was a small, dark smudge. I knelt, my knees cracking in the silence, and looked closer. It was a clump of rich, black earth, the kind you find deep in the woods after rain. It was still damp, and clinging to it was a single, withered leaf, blackened and curled at the edges as if it had been burned. A wave of dizziness washed over me. That soil did not come from my manicured lawn. It came from the dense woods that began just beyond my backyard. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the security app open on my phone. The motion alert was there, waiting for me. 3:04 a.m. I held my breath and tapped play. The video was different this time. It started the same way, with me walking calmly into the frame. I watched myself approach the door. I saw my hands move to the chair, lift it with a smooth, silent strength, and place it against the wall. I saw my fingers deftly slide the chain from its lock. I saw myself undo the deadbolt and the handle. The precision was terrifying. It was inhuman. But that was not the worst part. As my sleepwalking self pulled the door open, I did something new. I stopped and tilted my head, ever so slightly, as if listening to something just outside, something the camera's microphone could not pick up. A slow, faint smile touched my lips. It was a smile of recognition, of welcome. Then, I took a single, deliberate step outside, disappearing from the camera's view for nearly a minute. When I stepped back inside, my bare feet were dirty. I paused, wiped them absently on the mat, and then turned and walked away, leaving the door open to the world. I had not just opened the door for something. I had gone out to meet it. Sleep was no longer an option. The next 2 days were a blur fueled by bitter black coffee and a gnawing terror that had taken up permanent residence in my gut. I called in sick to my new job, offering a vague excuse about a stomach bug. I could not possibly focus on spreadsheets and introductory meetings when my own body was betraying me in the middle of the night. The house, my supposed sanctuary, now felt like a cage I shared with an unseen zookeeper, and I was the main attraction. The locks on my door felt decorative, a pointless gesture against the force that operated from within. My rationalizations were all gone now. Stress did not teach a person how to silently move furniture and unlatch complex locks while unconscious. This was something else. Something active. Something that wanted me to come outside. I spent hours on my laptop, my fingers flying across the keyboard, chasing down increasingly desperate threads of inquiry. I started with medical journals, reading about parasomnias and rare sleep disorders. Nothing fit. The articles spoke of confusion, clumsiness, and fragmented actions. They did not speak of the calm, purposeful efficiency I saw in the videos. They did not mention smiling at an unseen visitor or stepping out into the night. My search terms grew more esoteric. Compulsive sleepwalking, unlocking doors in sleep, local folklore Northwood Creek. That last one felt foolish, like a step into fantasy, but I was out of logical roads to follow. The search results were mostly tourist information, glowing reviews of hiking trails, and articles about the annual Founders' Day picnic. It was a town that prided itself on being quiet, safe, and utterly unremarkable. But then, buried on the 4th page of results, I found a link to a digitized archive of the old local newspaper, the Northwood Chronicle. It was a clunky, poorly designed website, but it was searchable. On a whim, I typed in disappearance. Most of the results were mundane. Teenagers who had run away and been found a day later. Elderly residents with dementia who had wandered from their homes. But one article, dated almost 40 years ago, made me stop. The headline was simple. Local man vanishes from home. The story was brief. A man named Alistair Finch, a reclusive bachelor who lived in a small house on the very edge of town, had disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle. His wallet and keys were on his nightstand. His car was in the driveway. The only strange detail, the one that made the hair on my arms stand up, was that his front door had been found wide open by a neighbor checking in on him. The article quoted the then sheriff, who said it looked as if Mr. Finch had simply woken up and walked away. He was never seen again. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the draft from my own front door. I kept digging. I searched for Alistair Finch's name, for anything related to that part of town. I found a single, rambling post on an old, defunct local forum from 10 years ago. The post was titled, "Anyone remember the Whisper Man?" The author, an anonymous user, talked about a local ghost story their grandparents used to tell them. A story meant to scare children into staying in their beds at night. They called it the Whisper Man, or sometimes the Caller in the Woods. The legend said it never came inside your house. It did not have to. It would stand outside in the dark and whisper your name. It would whisper promises, secrets, things only you would know. It would call to you until the part of you that was still wild, the part that remembered the woods before the houses, would wake up and answer. It would compel you to get out of bed, to undo the locks, and to walk outside to meet it. The post ended with a chilling sentence. They said Alistair Finch heard the whispers. It was a ghost story. A piece of childish folklore. It had to be. Yet, as I sat there in the unnerving silence of my new house, I thought about the video. I thought about the way my head had tilted, as if listening intently. I thought about the faint, knowing smile on my face. The rest of the day, I was a nerve stretched to its breaking point. Every sound was magnified. The hum of the furnace sounded like a low growl. The settling of the house sounded like footsteps in the attic. I kept catching flickers of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow darting just out of sight, a curtain seeming to sway in a room with no open windows. Was it real, or was my sleep-deprived mind manufacturing threats? The line between the two was becoming terrifyingly thin. I could no longer trust my own senses, my own home, or my own body. I needed more than just a video. I needed to know what it was that I was listening to. That evening, I set up my laptop on the coffee table, aimed at the front door. But this time, I did more than just enable the camera. I launched an audio recording program and placed a sensitive external microphone on the floor, right by the threshold. If I was going out there again tonight, I was going to capture whatever it was that was calling me. I did not even try to sleep. I barricaded myself in the living room, a sentinel watching over my own potential betrayal. I drank an entire pot of coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to warm the ice in my veins. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. I sat on the sofa, staring at the front door, my laptop screen glowing in the dark, its camera a single, unblinking eye. My own eyes felt gritty and raw, burning from exhaustion and a refusal to close. Sometime around 3 in the morning, a profound weariness began to settle over me. My thoughts grew muddy. The edges of the room seemed to soften and blur. I fought it, shaking my head, pinching my arm, but my body was a mutinous vessel yearning to sink into the dark waters of sleep. I must have drifted off, for how long I do not know. It could have been minutes, or an hour. I awoke with a gasp, my body jerking upright. The living room was filled with that familiar, penetrating cold. My gaze snapped to the front door. It was open. Not just a crack, but fully ajar, revealing a slice of the pitch-black street. A profound sense of failure and dread washed over me. It had happened again. Despite my vigilance, despite my caffeine-fueled resistance, it had won. For a moment, I just sat there, defeated. But then I remembered the microphone. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the laptop. I did not bother with the video at first. My focus was entirely on the audio file. I jammed my headphones on, plugging them into the jack and clicking the file open. I hit play. At first, there was only the low-level hum of the house and my own breathing. I fast-forwarded, my eyes scanning the waveform on the screen, looking for any spike, any deviation from the flat line of ambient noise. Then I saw it. A small, dense cluster of activity corresponding to the time of the motion alert. I went back and played that section again, turning the volume up until it hissed in my ears. Beneath the static, there was a sound. It was faint, incredibly so. It sounded like the rustle of dry leaves, like the sibilant whisper of sand being blown across glass. It was a sound that should have been natural, but it was threaded with an unmistakable cadence, a rhythm that was not random. It was a voice. I could not make out any words. It was too low, too distorted, a mere ghost of a sound captured on the edge of hearing. But I could feel it. It was a persuasive, intimate sound. It felt ancient. I listened to the 30-second clip over and over, my skin crawling. This was the sound that had beckoned Alistair Finch from his home. This was the sound that my sleeping mind found so compelling. With a shaking hand, I switched to the video file, syncing it up with the audio. I watched the now familiar scene unfold, myself rising, moving with that unnerving grace, undoing the locks as the faint, whispering static hissed from my headphones. I watched myself pull the door open and then tilt my head, listening. This time, I understood. I was not just listening, I was enraptured. A look of deep concentration was on my face, followed by that slow, horrifying smile. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, my focus absolute. I had watched these videos dozens of times, but now, knowing what to look for, I saw something new. It was right at the edge of the doorway, in the deep blackness of the porch. It was not a person or a creature. It was a distortion. For a fraction of a second, as the door swung fully open, the air just outside seemed to shimmer, to warp like the heat haze rising from asphalt on a summer day. It was a subtle, watery disturbance in the fabric of the night, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared. But I had seen it. I ripped the headphones off, my heart hammering. It was not just a voice. It was a presence. It had a physical, albeit nearly invisible, effect on the world around it. The mud on my mat, the whispers, the shimmering air, it was all pieces of a puzzle I did not want to solve. The entity from the ghost story was not just in the woods anymore. It was standing on my porch. It was standing just outside my door every night, patiently calling my name, coaxing me out. And every night, I was getting closer to answering it for good. The house was no longer a barrier. It was a stage, and the final act was approaching. This was the last night. I knew it with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a block of ice in my stomach. I could not do this again. I could not survive another night of my own body betraying me, of my own home becoming a threshold to some unspeakable darkness. My options were stark. I could flee, abandon the house and everything in it, and spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder. Or I could stay and fight. But how do you fight your own subconscious? How do you fight a whisper that only you can hear? I chose to fight. My plan was simple, desperate, and probably foolish. I would not allow myself to sleep. Not for a second. My evening was a ritual of preparation for war. I brewed the strongest coffee I could make, the smell thick and acrid in the kitchen. I lined up 3 cans of a highly caffeinated energy drink on the coffee table, their metallic sheen looking like munitions in the low light. I filled the bucket with ice water and set it by my feet. Every 15 minutes, my phone would shriek with an alarm, a digital drill sergeant to keep me on high alert. I would not succumb. I sat on the sofa, facing the front door, my laptop open and recording. The house was quieter than it had ever been. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting. As the hours ticked past midnight, the battle began. It was not a fight against the creature or an intruder, but against the crushing weight of my own biology. My eyelids became leaden shutters, desperate to close. My head grew heavy, lolling on my neck. The first time the alarm blared, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I plunged my hands into the ice water, the shock jolting me back to a state of painful awareness. Sometime after 2, the whispers started. At first, they were not in my ears, but in my head. Faint and far away, like a radio playing in another room. They were not just sounds anymore. They were thoughts, ideas, that felt like my own but were not. So tired. You should rest. Just for a minute. Let go. I shook my head, fighting to clear the invasive thoughts. I stood up and paced the living room, the floorboards groaning under my feet. The whispers grew louder, coalescing from thought into sound. They seemed to come from the dark corners of the room, from the hallway, from just outside the windows. They were sibilant and persuasive, the same dry, rustling voice from the recording. But now they had words. They whispered my name. They spoke of relief, of an end to anxiety and fear. Come out, they hissed, a sound like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. It's quiet out here. You can finally have peace. Let us in. Just open the door. My mind was a battlefield. Part of me, the exhausted, terrified part, was tempted. The promise of peace was a siren's call. I stumbled to the window and looked out into the blackness, but I could see nothing but my own pale, haunted reflection. The alarm on my phone screamed again. I gasped, stumbling back, my resolve hardening. I would not let it win. But the struggle was taking its toll. My perception began to fray. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and deepen, clinging to the furniture like dark shrouds. The silence between the whispers was heavy, full of unspoken pressure. I sat back down, my body trembling with exhaustion. I stared at the door, my vision blurring. The wood grain seemed to swirl and shift. It's so easy, the voice whispered, now seeming to come from right beside me. Just turn the lock. I do not know when I lost. My last conscious memory was of my phone alarm going off, the sound seeming to come from a great distance. I remember thinking I should reach for it, but my arm felt too heavy to lift. The darkness behind my eyes was soft and welcoming. It was a relief. The final record of that night exists only on the hard drive of my laptop. The video file shows the living room, silent and still for nearly an hour. Then it shows me. I rise from the sofa, not with the jerky movements of a man waking up, but with a single, fluid motion. It is a movement of unnatural grace, like a dancer or a predator. My eyes are open, but they are black and empty in the night vision footage. I do not walk to the door. I glide. My feet make no sound on the floorboards. I do not reach for the locks, the deadbolt, the handle, the chain. As my hand gets close, they simply click open on their own, a series of sharp, metallic sounds in the silence. I pull the door open, revealing the absolute black of the porch. I step onto the threshold, and for the first time, the camera captures what waits for me. It is not a man. It is a shape, a silhouette against the lesser dark of the street beyond. It is impossibly tall and thin, its limbs too long, its form shifting and indistinct as if woven from shadow and smoke. It seems to absorb the light around it. The shape raises one of its long, three-fingered hands, not in a threat, but in a gesture of welcome. An invitation. My recorded self takes a step forward, crossing the threshold to meet it. The moment my foot leaves the inside of the house, the video feed erupts into a blizzard of white noise. The audio shrieks with a final, deafening burst of static.